Hello, welcome back, everyone. This is Lisa Colon DeLay, and you're listening to Spark My Muse. Today is a guest interview with return guest Chuck DeGroat, who is a professor of pastoral care and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan. He also serves as the executive director of the Clinical Mental Health and Counseling Program. He's an author of multiple books, a licensed therapist, church consultant, and spiritual director. And he's been a wonderful champion of my book. And I just find his words of healing, his consultation within his writing, just a balm to the soul. So many people have benefited from his books. And it was really a delight to read his book that we're going to talk about now called Healing What's Within, Coming Home to Yourself and to God When You're Wounded, Weary, and Wandering. So that's a lot of W's in there. Thank you so much, Chuck, for coming on to speak about it today.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
So let's talk about trauma as loss of connection, because this is one of those points in the book that was, I'm not sure that we're all getting that when we are trying to figure out how to heal and we're thinking about our trauma. We might be thinking about something that's happened to us and something that we're responding to in a way that's not working anymore, but we might not think about it as a loss of connection or metabolize and really hear that it's not just the presence of suffering or hardship, but the way we feel alone during it that
Yeah,
causes that deepest damage.
yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, I think we tend to think about trauma as that thing that happened to me, the event, and it's really what happens within you. That's why I call it healing what's within. I mean, it's the imprint that is left behind. And what we know, I think from the ancient story of Scripture, from the very beginning, that primal story of disconnection in Genesis 3, and what we know from contemporary research is that trauma festers in aloneness. When two people go through the same experience and one has companionship and the other one doesn't, the stress of that experience can become trauma for the one who does not experience the care and connection and companionship. And so that's such an important part of this, and really then points the way toward healing through connection, reconnection, reunion, right?
Yeah, well said. That's an aspect we might not incorporate into the healing process necessarily because we might not notice that it's part of the wound that's there has been that aloneness, has been that
Yeah.
isolation and feeling like no one's there to witness.
Yeah.
For your own life, I guess I'm wondering too, when did that strike you as a necessary issue as you healed?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, it goes all the way back to my late 20s when I was a seminary student and a know it all, and was confronted by a counseling professor who invited me to do my own work. And I realized that there were deep wounds within me, and I'd been coping in ways that, on the outside, people wouldn't have really seen any problem because I looked and dressed the part of a put together white guy who got a 4.0 GPA, right, and excelled in seminary. And on the inside, I was in deep pain, and so that's when it began for me. But then I went through a season of some pretty significant spiritual abuse, and after that, I mean, I kind of isolated. I hunkered down. I think people might have thought that I was doing my work and staying connected, but I put my head down and I sort of vowed to never let it happen again. And I thought, if I show up well, if I perform well, if I please people, all the things that you try to do in your next, for me, my next pastoral gig, then I won't have to experience that ever again. And the reality is I ended up in a hospital in on a vacation, and my body was in bad shape, and I was 40, I think 41, 42 years old at the time. And so that phrase, "the body keeps the score," is really, really true. And mine kept the score amidst disconnection.
There's a lot to be said for that. You're just pushing it down and pushing through. It doesn't mean it goes away or that the body will forget, even if we try to put it in the back of our mind. Yeah, it comes back and with a vengeance. One of the people you quote in your book is Peter A. Levine, who's the author of Healing Trauma, and so many great quotes that are sprinkled out throughout your book. This one says, in short, trauma is about loss of connection to ourselves, to our bodies, to our families, to others, and to the world around us. This loss of connection is often hard to recognize because it doesn't happen all at once. It can happen slowly over time, and we adapt to these subtle changes sometimes without even noticing them. These are the hidden effects of trauma, the ones that most of us keep to ourselves. We may
Yeah.
simply sense that we do not feel quite right without ever becoming fully aware of what's taking place. That is, the gradual undermining of self esteem, self confidence, feelings of well being, and connection to life that kind of sneaks up slowly on you.
Yeah. I think when people hear the word trauma, they think, "Well, that's really bad." And we've typically, even in the counseling world, we've thought about trauma in terms of post-traumatic stress, from war or a major tornado or hurricane taking out your house or the death of someone very close to you. But trauma is Greek for wound, and it has to do with our woundedness, and we're all wounded. And if you're in the Christian tradition, you probably have some sense that we bear a wound, and I call it a primal trauma, an ancient wound, the echo of disconnection from Genesis chapter 3. There's something of that experience of life east of Eden that we all know deep down in our bones, and so each of us bears a wound, right? And so we all carry pain, and I think it's really important for us to begin to put words to our pain. Without connection, without someone to bear witness to the ache that we experience, perhaps as I talk about in the book, the spiritual abuse, the harm that you've experienced, without without someone to bear witness, without, as I talk about further, without listening for God's kind, "Where are you?" Those first words, that first question that God asks in Genesis 3. I think we do end up going it alone, and that's a recipe for increasing disconnection and more trauma.
As you're saying that, it makes me think of another question, series of questions I was going to ask you that had to do with those three questions you bring up in the beginning of the book, which is, where are you? God us, inviting us to see just how lost, alone, and alienated we've become, and encouraging us to come out of hiding. The second is, who are you? God wonders, inviting us to muse on the story of that original wound. And have you eaten from the tree? God asks, inviting us to explore how we, through our own futile but fervent efforts, try to address the deep hunger of our hearts. And you say, let these questions be invitations, not vehicles of shame, because that's what a lot of us have gone to for that, or have been told, like, this is how you're all messed up from this fall, as you may have once been taught to hear them. God asks them all for the sake of restored relationship, reunion, and communion with Him, with one another, and with the groaning creation itself longing for restoration. So, as you brought up those questions, really seen in a different light of how we heal, not how we feel more disconnected and more ashamed, more traumatized.
Yeah, I grew up with that story as the great tragedy, and my sense was that God was really, really mad, and God remains mad. And so it was years ago. I mean, I think it was probably the early 2000s when I began listening for that first question, "Where are you?" in a different way and experiencing God with more curiosity. Like you and I are kindred spirits in the sense that we've sort of been steeped in the ancient desert tradition, the desert mothers and fathers, contemplative Christianity, and it was really the kindness of some of the contemplative writers that maybe sort of wonder about the story again. Like, might God actually be, it says that God is walking in the garden in the cool of the day, which is to say, in the Middle East, you wouldn't take a walk at noon. You'd take a walk later, when the sun's going down. And I remember reading a commentator saying, God was going for a walk at the time that they normally went for walks. And he was saying, "Where are you? I'm out for our walk and I don't see you. And I'm longing for you to be with me." And so That set me on this trajectory for listening more deeply for those questions. Where are you? Who told you? What are you hungry and thirsty for? Is God really inviting us back to reconnection and reunion? God is the compassionate witness to our wounds, to our pain, to our trauma.
Mm. Those 3 questions, if you don't see God as a friend already, sound like they're very accusatory coming from a
Yeah.
really judgmental, like, "Why have you eaten from the tree? Who told you that?" Like, angry, upset, and probably, let's face it, from our parents or our society or those judging, condemning words. If you see that, well, God has been walking with them every single day and they're deeply connected, then this one time they're not there, it's a concern. It's a loving concern for reconnection. I think I never absorbed that, certainly. And so I think that story in a way pushed me further from God. I didn't see it as any kind of invitation to look, see what God already sees.
I like the word invitation. I mean, I think that God, I hear echoes of Luke 15 and the parable of God as the compassionate father to the lost son. I hear echoes of a God who is both father and mother in that story, because you know what the father does in Luke 15 is what a mother would have done. And so I see and hear a God who is kind and wants to bear witness to us, and wants to hold us. You know, even the father in Luke 15 doesn't come with accusations. He comes with really embodied symbols, you know, a ring, a robe, sandals of reunion, of reconnection, of a rediscovery of dignity and belonging and worth and companionship and purpose, right? And so it's really, I think it's a better story than we imagined.
Right, absolutely. There's a portion of the book where you talk about this hard work of healing that happens in obscured ways. This is something that I haven't seen too much happen in books about healing. You talk about John O'Donohue, who talks about negative introspection.
Yeah.
And it's a word that a lot of people aren't going to be just naturally familiar with. But we're living in a time that is the opposite of how I grew up, which is nobody had therapy unless you had a total breakdown where you couldn't, like, you were
Right.
catatonic. And then it was whispered, like, so and so had therapy. But now in a younger generation, there's a lot of people that just start a sentence, well, my therapist said. I find that really positive. By the same token, we can wind up problematizing and pathologizing almost every single thing about our human experience when it's just the typical ups and downs of living in these bodies in this fallen world with all of its stuff. And so this thing that John says is sort of something that almost sounds countercultural now because it's not about hyper focus. It's about how we honor that deep work that happens in obscured ways. And so I'm just wondering if you could give a little taste test of what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we are living in a day where it seems like, particularly with social media, like all our business is out there, right? And that to be vulnerable is to share every last thing. And I think what O'Donohue was saying, you know, before he passed in, you know, the mid 2000s is the soul is shy and it only reveals itself in, he uses the metaphor of a neon consciousness. He says, we live under neon lights. And he says, the soul reveals itself under soft lights. Imagine yourself, you know, under a soft light with a glass of wine, sitting with a good friend. That's when you feel safe enough, not under the bright lights of interrogation. And it does seem that today we're living out of this sort of neon consciousness where it's like we've got to reveal all, and we know maybe a little bit too much. You know, you see some of these reality TV shows where people share stuff about their lives and do things on TV that we, you know, back in the day when you and I were growing up, we would never have imagined, right? And so I do think that it's about honoring the shyness of the soul. When I do my work, I want to honor the pace that a client wants to go at. We call that titration in the counseling world. and we don't expect for results to happen overnight. In fact, what do we even mean by results anyway, right? And so we're simply bearing witness, knowing and being known, and hoping that the soul, when it's ready, the body and soul, when it's ready, will reveal what it needs to reveal.
There's such a profound mystery to that that is in some way none of our business because God is at work,
Mm,
and yet we're cooperating with something deeper happening and trying to a little bit stay out of our own way and stay out of God's way in the sense that we make room for the light of God to shine, and yet
mm,
not just go picking at wounds, until until
yeah,
it's, like, all a mess, but I think part of the human condition is, like, "What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me?" Too.
yeah,
So it kind of it
yeah,
plays into that.
yeah, yeah. I think it does, and I think I turned 54 this year, and I was telling a friend yesterday, I thought I'd be there. I thought I would have arrived at 40, and that didn't happen. And then 50, I had a sort of a crisis at 50 where I thought, I'm not as far along as I imagined I would be. And now I think I've given up on that illusion of enlightenment, of arrival, right? And I'm maybe a bit more in touch with my fragility or my messiness, and so we're about to start a clinical mental health counseling program at our seminary right now. And I was telling this friend, it's bringing up a lot because I kind of feel like I thought I'd do this at a point in life when I had arrived, when I was ready to be the guru and offer the wisdom, right? And what a uh, you know, I don't know how even to describe it. I'm almost embarrassed to say it out loud, Lisa, but I mean, I think I'm reconciling with the reality that I can show up as myself, and people may be disappointed. In fact, they might be disappointed that I'm not the guru or I haven't arrived, but I'm reconciling with that, and that's taken a while and some years of living. I
Hmm.
wonder if you've experienced some of that over the years.
Um, the Desert Fathers say that one of the best ways to become humble is to be humiliated.
Yeah,
I think I just felt a lot of humiliation, and that doesn't mean I'm humble, but I've that's how I find it. I've a little bit like
yeah,
you're saying, like, "Oh, wait, maybe I'm not up to the job." But I think in our humility, people find us relatable, and
yeah,
on the one hand, they'll say, "Give me all the answers. I Tell me the wisdom. I want all the answers." But if it's just descended from on high, does it even work for real people, or is it just for holy people?
mm,
I think that there's something to be said for just walking alongside people as, just a fellow pilgrim instead of not the sage on the stage, but the guide on the side.
mm,
And so I think wrestling with that is really important because it shows if you're wrestling with it that you're aware that where am I in the process and where should I be? Instead of thinking, yeehaw, like the cavalier spirit of like, come
yeah,
follow me. I have it all together. If you feel like you don't
yeah,
have it all together, that's probably one of the best qualities for a leader is to be
yeah,
humble and ready to
yeah,
hear from God. I
yeah,
always worry about the overconfident leaders who think they're gurus. Actually, they frighten me.
yeah. I'm with you. I think, the part of the connection to this is that I think even in the therapeutic world, I wrote this book on narcissism in the church, right? And talking primarily about pastors, but I do think in the therapeutic world there's a growing narcissism, and there is this sense sometimes, not just in the way we project ourselves out there on social media with, our pithy sayings and our self-help and stuff like that, but some sense that if I ask the right questions and I sit long enough, I will figure you out. And I remember early on in my counseling journey, a therapist saying to me, she sort of boiled down my story to something that had happened. And she said, this is the key. And she said it with high certainty and with this sense of, I know what happened to you. And she'd sat with me for no more than an hour. I took her word seriously because I really respected her. And I thought, well, this is it. And for the next 10 years, I looked for some of the things that she had said had happened and I didn't find them. And I realized that it was a real miss. and we don't sum up someone's story in an hour. In fact, we're mysteries that are being revealed over the course of a lifetime. There's more work for me to do. There's more work for you to do, for all of us to do. And so I think there's some humility for those of us who are therapists, for my students who are being trained to be therapists too, that we don't become masters of someone's story or figure them out. We're always sitting before mysteries.
This leads really well into the next thing I wanted to ask you. You talk about in the book quite profoundly, personally, about your resistance to meeting God in the dark night, which is if there's going to be a mystery, that's it. It's this
Yeah,
dark night for almost a decade, you say, and maybe not to
yeah,
get all into it because that's what the book is for, but maybe just give
yeah.
listeners a taste test of sort of what you're speaking about in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think, dark nights come in all different shapes and sizes, and you and I could probably have an important conversation about that, because too often we think that a depression is a dark night, but a dark night is very different than clinical depression or something like that. And it is this season where it seems as if, and I use that word intentionally, seems as if God has removed God's presence, and we're all alone. And really what God is removing is all the small g gods, all the things that we had wrapped our hearts around. And I think in losing my first job in ministry and being fired in a way that was deeply painful, there's so much reputation wrapped around that. There was this sense that, well, I'm done. It's over. I'll always have the scarlet letter on me. And what I didn't do was honor the dark night at the time. I decided to climb out of my pit and make something of myself. That was that season of isolation. Bigger, better, stronger, faster. I can succeed at this. And I got another job in San Francisco as a pastor, and I worked really hard. I led people into spiritual retreats, counseling. I preached regularly, and I was far more disconnected from God than I knew. What was happening was that there was a kind of death happening that I didn't know about at the time. Again, God wasn't gone, but God was sort of peeling away layers of my false self, my false selves, plural. I do think that moment of ending up in a hospital bed in Mexico, that was an eye opening moment, because oftentimes it's when you're laid bare, when you've experienced that great humiliation in the midst of ignoring the small h humiliations along the way. That was the beginning of a kind of awakening to something more at work in my life. But as you know, Dark Knights, they don't have Disney endings either. They're really painful, and what you have to see about yourself is that you've been living out of an illusion, as James Finley often says, and that the illusion is exposed, and mine was exposed.
Right. And how much really, as you're looking back now, how much of the dark night was really untended to grief?
Yeah, right.
Disappointment and grief that you're just leave you confused and in a complex.
Yeah. And I think oftentimes in Dark Nights, we, particularly in American culture, and I think in sort of white American evangelical spirituality, sort of pretty up the Dark Night, or something like that, or we certainly spiritually bypass it, and we
Mm.
leave our shame and our grief behind, as you're saying. And so there was a lot of grief, there was a lot of shame, but I locked those in the dungeon, and I didn't quite know I was doing that, but that's what I was doing. My grief and shame was relegated to the shadows, and I had to return to it. But after many years, I mean, it's festering down there, and that's, oftentimes, for us to really look at our trauma in the face, it's opening up that dungeon, going into the shadows and bearing witness to the grief, to the shame.
Yeah, and what you're talking about, it it happens if anybody finds themselves in, like, the dark night of the senses where nothing really feels like anything, and
Yeah.
again, we're not talking about depression and that non-feeling
Yes.
stuff that happens there, but this is, like, where God doesn't seem present in any of the ways that you connected before, and you
Yeah.
just feel empty and disconnected, and
Yeah.
but we automatically, unconsciously will just have these mechanisms to cope where that just happens. And then later you're like, wait a second, I might need to go back and look at how I got through that. And it might have not been very healthy and I might have
Yeah,
missed some stuff.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, I think that's it, and the you point out a distinction that I think a lot of people don't know about the dark night of the senses, the dark night of the spirit, right? And it's like, those worship songs or that book or that church that you used to go to, or all those things that, you sort of trusted in is like, that's my experience of God. They lose their punch, so to speak, right? And I think that that's terribly frightening. But what's even more frightening to me is in our sort of evangelical industrial complex, we've given people a lot of ways to spiritually bypass, to find their way to a different kind of dopamine high or experience. And we've failed to invite them into the dark night. The counsel that I got over the years was spiritual bypassing. I didn't have women and men who are able to sit with me and say, well, let's just honor what's happening here, what lurks in the shadows. I had people say, well, why don't you try this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you go there? Why don't we do the spiritual retreat? Why don't we do, and you could try a lot of those things. I mean, you could spend, as I did, more than a decade trying all those kinds of things and avoiding the real pain.
Yeah. And the work that it takes to go to the hard places that are
Yeah.
they're painful. So we'd rather have the feel good, like B12 shot of whatever it is to make us feel better. And what you say about dopamine is great segue into this part about desire you have in the book around page 199, 200. I love that you talk about addictions and the dopamine fixes.
Mm,
You say, desire is that deep and wide river of love within you. Your self soothing strategies are desire substitutes.
yeah.
It says these compulsions live in the gap where longing and love should grow and blossom.
Yeah.
I love that distinction because that is a lot of times what we're doing again unawares.
Yeah.
We have desire, that's good, that's fine. That's part of the dynamism of life.
Yeah.
And yet we will self soothe and substitute, make these substitutions.
We chase the fulfillment of desire, right? There's this old, very ancient distinction between possessive desire and dispossessive desire. And possessive desire is like, I'm going to grab it. It's Genesis 3 all over again, right? I'm going to grasp for the thing that I think will make me feel better. The Christian way is not the eradication of desire, it's the dispossession of desire. It's the open handedness. It's, I'm going to long. It might not be fulfilled in all the ways that I think it will be fulfilled. C.S. Lewis is probably the great theologian of desire, if not St. Augustine. But he says it's not in the sunset, it's not in the book, it's not in the romantic relationship. That's an echo. It awakens. You can't become one with the sunset. You stand on the beach and the sun goes down, and your heart is in wonder and awe, and you can't become one with it. Your heart just aches before it. And so, but I think, in this world in which we chase dopamine highs, we're constantly evading deeper desire and living like functionally disconnected from our own hearts. And so we live at a very shallow level ultimately.
Right. And there's a misunderstanding of desire, I think, in an extremely meaningful way, so that we're attempting to satisfy desire when desire itself is sort of an impetus, not an end in itself that can be satisfied. And knowing that that is something that propels us toward God is designed for that, but not that it has an end, that it has a satisfaction in a way. Not that that helps all the time, but the idea that desire and longing is good
Mm.
and it is like the sibling of joy. A lot of times we'll find it the other way because we'll use the substitutions, like you say, and then desire will end up to be disappointment.
C.S. Lewis said joy is the stab, the pang, the inconsolable longing, right? And you're like, what? That's joy? you know but because we think joy is the dopamine high, the hit of pastor, play my favorite worship song, because whenever I hear that worship song, the spirit just, no, actually, maybe the deeper joy will come in the longing for communion with God, not in the thing that you thought, not in the playing the worship song or the rereading of your favorite book, right? And so I do think, this gets to that third question that God asks: Where have you taken your hunger and thirst? Because I think that part of the work that we're invited to do is to hunger and thirst more deeply. Some version of that question is what Jesus asks more than any other. What do you long for? What are you hungry for? What are you thirsty for? But first, we've got to ask the question: where have we gone with our hunger and thirst? How have we looked for that salve for the wound? Because that's what we're doing, is we're just trying to cover over the wound that we were talking about earlier. We're trying to, instead of addressing the trauma, I'm just going to drink a lot. I'm going to overeat. I'm going to overexercise. I'm going to perform. And we end up avoiding the wound. So we have to ask ourselves, where have we taken our hunger and thirst? But in like doing the work, so many people live pretty functionally numb, and they go from desire substitute to desire substitute, dopamine high to dopamine high, and they're not really living their lives. They've lost touch with who they are. They've forgotten their names, as G.K. Chesterton said a long time ago. We've forgotten our name, and I did too. And the scary thing about it is, you can pastor, you can lead contemplative retreats, you can sit with people in counseling, and I was alienated from myself to a large degree. Not completely, but that's that inheritance, in a sense, of Genesis 3, of disconnection, of a self-alienation that we live with as a result of that, the primal trauma and the traumas of our life.
Mm. For people who are listening who see themselves in some of the things we're describing, like chasing desire, chasing the substitutes,
Yeah.
do you have a nugget of wisdom to help just get a foothold in that, to stop sliding down the mountain, to just kinda get a foothold, and
Yeah.
what's a starting point?
Yeah, every with every chapter I offer practices, and the first one is the practice. I think I called it the practice of returning to yourself, which, by the way, is going to sound very hypertherapeutic to some. And it's what I say right at the outset is, it's actually ancient wisdom. Those are the words of Saint Augustine: "Do not go outward, return to yourself. In your heart, God dwells." And there is this sense of we've got to return to an inner conversation, that deeper soul conversation, to step away from those things that are causing us to numb, to step out of those places, those relationships, those situations that are keeping us at a distance from ourselves, and into a conversation with our own hearts and the ache of our own hearts. And I think, I'm a trauma therapist. We now know that part of that means reconnecting with our bodies. And I'll often, with embodied practices, I'll invite people simply to connect with their breath. And I will have people say to me, I don't know the last time I breathed. They'll say, it feels very weird to be connected to my body. I've lived very disembodied, and oftentimes that's where it begins. That's where it began in the ancient church as well. You're a student of Evagrius and Cassian and others, right? These are very ancient practices. And so connecting to our bodies, connecting to our breath, those are some of the first ways. And what I will say is that, the practices build, but oftentimes in this work, that's only the beginning, because what you discover is that, oh, as I reconnect, there's a lot of pain there. I think my second practice is the practice of befriending suffering. It's saying, ouch. It's saying, ow, this hurts. I've been hurting for too long, and I want to do something differently.
Spiritual formation's my jam, a lot of people know that,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
I always really love it when a book like yours, and like the ones I love the best, aren't just informational, but they will invite you in with practice and reflection, or maybe a prayer, or something that isn't just your brain storing more information, but is
That's
something to
right.
slow down and actually absorb and metabolize it, and maybe change your breathing, maybe disrupt the normal habits. Because, like Augustine says about coming back to yourself, it really means leaving all the distractions that have been pulling you in a million different directions, and
Yeah.
coming
Right.
back to the lover of your soul is
Yes.
coming back to reality.
Yeah. So part of what I want to do is invite people into some beginning practices. This is not a substitute for deep spiritual direction or therapy. But I love the old St. Patrick's breastplate prayer, Christ above me, Christ below me, Christ to my left, Christ to my right. And I integrate that with breath so that as we're praying and remembering God's presence in and around us, we're breathing in and breathing out. And I think that there's a profound integration that happens there. People come to me sometimes and they'll say, "Well, I'm doing this therapeutic work with my body, but I don't know how that relates to my faith." And so what I'm wanting to do is to say it's integral. It was never meant to be separated, and so let's do this work in a very integrated way.
That's just one of the greater maladies of our time is just how we're sort of brains going from room to room with our bodies just kind of this
Yeah,
vehicle for moving our brains from room to room. It's not surprising that we have so much disease that we don't even realize it until we're completely laid out. It's like, "Oh, my body stopped working." We never got the little signals when we needed them that
yeah,
something wasn't okay because we've been just so disconnected on repeat for how long.
yeah,
If people feel like that, it's like, that's the water we're swimming in. If you
yeah,
aren't like that, something would be abnormal, maybe in a good way about you.
yeah, yeah. And you have physicians like Gabor Mate out there today, in his book, The Myth of Normal. And Gabor is pretty well known nowadays, and certainly podcasts all over the place. Well, he's a physician who's saying, disconnection is really the root of disease. And so he's making connections to all kinds of things, chronic pain and cancer and many other things. And I think one of the things he does, particularly for women, is set the legacy of voicelessness, of living in a patriarchal world, leads to disease in women. He makes these connections that are quite profound, and really related to cultural movements that we've never really connected to disease before. And so I think there's so much more here that we could tease out. There's so many more intersections. Yeah.
I wanted to see if you have, like, a final thought or some taste tests for any listeners that would be pre-ordering, because this comes out in October, I believe. It's October?
Yeah. I think the last thing I'll say is a number of people have been asking, so is this a follow up to this narcissism book that you wrote? And and I took some time after that, and there are some folks that said, "Hey, you should do like a part two of that," and I didn't really want to do that. And so, in a sense, it's not at all a follow up to it. Um, and in another sense, it very much is the like, here's the work if you've experienced harm or abuse, or if like many of us, maybe you didn't have a particular experience of spiritual abuse or harm or sexual abuse or physical abuse, but your needs weren't met in some of the core ways they needed to be met growing up. This is a pathway to healing. When I think about the conversations that are happening, and you see a lot of these happening nowadays, on abuse in the church, the spiritual abuse, a lot of it is about what's happening out there, what happened to me. Oftentimes, what I say is what I can't control because it is out there and it's in institutions, and I simply there's not enough that I can do to remedy that.
Mm.
What the point of this is we've got to turn our attention to what's within. For any of us to heal, it's not that we ignore the institutional, the systemic abuse and harm, but if you're trying to deal with that from a place of profound woundedness, you're only going to become more wounded in the process. And
Mm.
so we turn our attention to where trauma is within, not outside, and we heal what's within. And that's really the core of it. And so I want to see folks who have experienced pain now do the work because we need, Henry Nouwen used the phrase wounded healers, right? But people whose wounds have been healed and who can do the work of healing. And so one of the reasons I admire you and I assign your book and wait for your next book is because your work comes out of your own healing journey and the depth of your own companionship with God. And so I'm really grateful for you, Lisa. Grateful for the time with you today.
Thank you so much, I appreciate that. I think we're kindred spirits in that attending to the hurt and the wound and not just putting on a front or, moving past it is
That's right.
so critical for us to become, of course, healthier people, but healthier communities, Christian communities.
Yeah.
And when we see all the dysfunction around us in our world, it can feel pretty
Yeah.
overwhelming. But I think one of the easiest things to do is not do our own work and point out and say, look at all that's wrong. Look,
Hmm. Yeah.
instead of saying, let me take a little time, sit back, and just find a few things that I would like to improve in my own
Yeah.
heart and with my
Yeah.
own pain, because it's a lot easier to look
Yeah.
outward to find what's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe you could just tell listeners some of the best places to find you. I know you offer some great things too on your website as I was looking on it.
Yeah. So the website is chuckdegroat.net, and there I try to offer some things, including some courses. In fact, if you pre-order the book, I think this will come out before the book comes out. But if there is time and you have a chance to pre-order, you can get a spiritual abuse course that I put together that looks at abuse and trauma and healing. And so and that's on my website. You can find all that. But I teach at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, and we're starting a counseling program here. If you're ever coming through Grand Rapids or Holland, Michigan, you can also find me in real life in a particular space and time. You know, there are actually people living in real life in particular space and time, right? Not just on the internet. So, um,
That's always nice to know. It's not just a simulation.
yeah, that's right.
There's actual people,
Yeah, that's
characters
great.
playing as well. So
That's right. Yeah,
again, the book is called Healing What's Within, really long subtitle. Coming home to yourself and to God when you're wounded, weary, and wandering is just a balm if you're wounded. And there's a lot of us out there, the walking wounded, people who've been injured by the church or spiritual trauma, but also just it's hard to get through this life unscathed. So I think it applies to most people that sometimes we just haven't dealt with some of the things that have laid waste to us in one time or another. So thank you so much for this.
yeah. And thank you for continuing to write. Can't wait for your next one, Lisa.